Jean Seberg entered Hollywood as a promise. Young, luminous, almost painfully pure. She looked like the future the industry wanted to believe in. Chosen from obscurity and placed under the brightest lights, she was introduced to the world as a discovery, a symbol of fresh beginnings. But what Hollywood gives quickly, it often takes back without warning. From the start, Jean was different in ways the system did not know how to manage. She was thoughtful where obedience was expected, curious where silence was safer, sensitive in an industry that rewarded emotional armor. Her innocence was real, and that paradoxically made her dangerous. Hollywood does not fear weakness, it fears independence. Jean did not arrive with cynicism or strategy. She believed in fairness. She believed that talent would be met with patience, that sincerity would be protected. Those beliefs made her vulnerable, because once the industry sensed she could not be easily shaped, admiration turned into discomfort. Her smile became famous. So did the scrutiny behind it. Criticism arrived early, sharp and unforgiving. Reviews did not simply judge her performances. They questioned her right to exist in the spotlight at all. Jean absorbed every word, internalizing doubt before she had learned how to defend herself. And quietly, Hollywood began to step away. This was not rejection with confrontation. It was rejection by absence. Phone calls stopped, roles evaporated. Support vanished without explanation. Jean Seberg had not failed. She had unsettled, and unsettling figures are rarely allowed to stay. What followed was not a fall, but an exile. An actress pushed beyond the borders of the industry that once claimed her. A woman learning too late that Hollywood's love is conditional, and its silence devastating. This is the story of Jean Seberg, not as a scandal, not as a rumor, but as a warning. A reminder that sometimes the greatest crime in Hollywood is not failure, but refusing to become what the system demands. When Hollywood turned away, it did not do so with drama or finality. It simply stopped calling. Jean Seberg found herself suspended in a quiet limbo. Still young, still talented, but suddenly unwanted. The industry that had once presented her as a miracle now treated her as a mistake it preferred to forget. There was no apology, no second chance, only distance. Jean felt the rejection deeply, but she did not fight it the way Hollywood expected. Instead of pleading for acceptance, she left. Crossing the Atlantic was not an escape plan. It was an act of survival. In France, she encountered something unfamiliar: curiosity without control, admiration without ownership. Paris did not demand obedience. It offered freedom. With Breathless, Jean Seberg was transformed. Not manufactured, but revealed. The camera followed her lightly, almost casually, allowing her to exist rather than perform. She was modern, effortless, alive. Smoking on the Champs-Élysées, she embodied a new kind of femininity that felt unguarded and self-directed. Europe did not ask her to be perfect. It asked her to be present. For the first time, Jean felt seen rather than managed. The irony was sharp. She had failed in Hollywood. She had become iconic elsewhere. But success abroad only deepened her estrangement from America. Hollywood watched from a distance, uncomfortable with the fact that Jean no longer needed its approval. Independence, once again, marked her as suspect. She was no longer the innocent discovery. She was a woman who had escaped control. Jean's confidence grew, but so did her restlessness. Fame in Europe brought recognition, but it could not erase the wound left by rejection. She lived between cultures, between identities, belonging fully to neither. Praise felt conditional, stability felt temporary, and beneath the surface, something darker began to form. Jean had learned that admiration could disappear overnight. She trusted less. She questioned more. The world felt less safe than it once had. And while France offered her a new image, it could not protect her from the invisible consequences of being cast aside by the place that first defined her. Reinvention saved her career. It did not save her peace. Jean Seberg did not set out to challenge power. She set out to care. In the late 1960s, her conscience pulled her toward causes that Hollywood preferred to observe from a safe distance: civil rights, racial justice, voices pushed to the margins. Jean listened when others looked away. and she acted when silence felt like complicity. She donated money. She spoke openly. She aligned herself with movements that frightened institutions built on control. That was enough. Without warning, Jean became a subject of surveillance. Files were opened, phones were monitored. Private life was no longer private. The FBI did not need proof of wrongdoing. It needed a narrative. And Jean, already labeled difficult, already estranged from Hollywood, was an easy target. She was young, visible, and unprotected. Her fame became a liability rather than a shield. What followed was not investigation, it was erosion. False stories were planted in the press. Rumors were encouraged, not corrected. The most devastating smear targeted her most intimate vulnerability, weaponizing pregnancy and shame to break her credibility and spirit. The intent was not exposure. It was destruction. Jean felt the walls closing in. She became hyper-vigilant, questioning every sound, every stranger, every coincidence. Trust dissolved, sleep fractured, fear seeped into ordinary moments until nothing felt neutral anymore. The world she moved through felt watched, hostile, unpredictable, and she was not imagining it. Hollywood offered no defense, no solidarity, no protection. The industry that once celebrated her now benefited from her isolation. Silence became complicity, distance became safety. Jean was left to absorb the consequences alone. The psychological toll was immense. Knowing you are monitored does not simply frighten you. It rewires you. It changes how you speak, how you love, how you exist. Jean's natural openness hardened into suspicion. Her sensitivity turned inward, feeding anxiety and despair. She had crossed an invisible line, not artistic, political, and in doing so, she learned a brutal truth. In Hollywood, being outspoken is forgivable only when it is harmless. Jean Seberg was no longer harmless. She had become inconvenient. An inconvenience, when attached to a woman without institutional protection, becomes a sentence. By the time Jean Seberg understood how far she had been pushed, there was nowhere left that felt safe. Hollywood had already turned its back. Europe, once a refuge, could not fully shield her from a pressure that followed quietly, relentlessly across borders. She became a woman without a country. Admired in theory, abandoned in practice. Exile is not always geographic. Sometimes it is emotional, sometimes it is permanent. Jean drifted between cities, relationships, and brief professional returns that never quite anchored her. Work appeared, then disappeared. Promises were made, then quietly withdrawn. Each setback reinforced the sense that she was being erased in real time, not forgotten, but deliberately avoided. Isolation deepened her anxiety. She began to withdraw from friends, unsure who could be trusted. Conversations felt dangerous. Privacy felt fragile. The knowledge that she had once been surveilled made every coincidence feel loaded, every silence suspicious. Even moments of happiness were shadowed by fear that they would be taken away. Her personal life offered little relief. Relationships fractured under the strain of her paranoia and exhaustion. Love, once a source of grounding, became another arena of instability. She feared abandonment, and in fearing it, often brought it closer. Alcohol entered her life not as rebellion, but as refuge. Medication followed. Relief became routine. These were not choices made lightly. They were attempts to quiet a nervous system that never fully recovered from being targeted. Jean's sensitivity, once her strength, now amplified every wound. Publicly, she faded. Privately, she unraveled. The cruelest part of exile was not the loss of status, but the loss of safety. Jean felt permanently exposed, as though the world could reach into her life without consequence. She no longer believed in protection, institutional or personal. Trust felt naive. Hope felt dangerous. Hollywood, watching from a distance, did nothing. There were no apologies, no reassessments, no recognition of harm. Jean Seberg had become a cautionary absence, a name mentioned softly, a story left unfinished. And in that unfinished space, her isolation hardened into despair. She was no longer fighting for a career. She was fighting to feel real, to feel unseen enough to breathe. By the late 1970s, Jean Seberg was living in a state of near constant exhaustion, physical, emotional, psychological. The fight to stay grounded had consumed more energy than she had left. What once felt like resistance now felt like survival stretched too thin. Her mental health deteriorated visibly. Depression settled in with a weight that never lifted. Anxiety tightened around ordinary moments, turning daily life into a series of threats to be navigated rather than experiences to be lived. She struggled to separate memory from fear, past danger from present safety. The world felt hostile even when it was quiet. She sought help, but help came fragmented. Hospitals offered treatment without understanding. Medication numbed symptoms without restoring trust. Each attempt to stabilize left her feeling less herself, more distant, more hollow. Jean feared that healing meant erasure, that the cost of peace would be the loss of the identity she had already watched dissolve. Her career was effectively over, not announced, not mourned, just gone. Without work, structure disappeared. Without structure, the mind wandered back to its darkest places. Loneliness became suffocating. The absence of purpose cut deeper than rejection ever had. She felt disposable, a woman once celebrated, now tolerated only as memory. Jean's personal relationships reflected this collapse. She oscillated between desperate attachment and complete withdrawal, unsure how to ask for help without feeling exposed. Friends sensed her fragility, but many did not know how to reach her. Some tried, many drifted away. Alcohol became more frequent, medication more aggressive, sleep more elusive. She spoke at times of being tired, not of living, but of fighting, tired of explaining, tired of being misunderstood, tired of existing under the shadow of forces she could never fully escape. On August 30th, 1979, Jean Seberg was found dead in Paris, alone, quietly. There was no spectacle, no public reckoning. The official explanations offered closure without comfort. For many, her death felt less like a sudden tragedy than the inevitable end of a long abandonment. Jean Seberg did not fall in a moment. She descended slowly, invisibly, as the world looked away. Jean Seberg's legacy is often reduced to a single image: the young woman in Breathless, cigarette in hand, walking through Paris with effortless cool. That image is elegant, modern, immortal, but it is also incomplete, because behind it lived a woman who was systematically abandoned by the very industry that once claimed her. Jean was not destroyed by failure. She was destroyed by isolation. She believed, perhaps too sincerely, that integrity mattered, that caring openly was not a liability, that institutions designed to elevate talent would also protect it. Hollywood taught her otherwise. When she became inconvenient, politically aware, emotionally vulnerable, impossible to control, it stepped away. Not loudly, not cruelly, simply enough to leave her alone. What makes her story so unsettling is how ordinary that abandonment was. There was no public trial, no dramatic exile, just silence, the most effective punishment of all. Jean Seberg did not ask to be a symbol. She did not seek martyrdom. She wanted to act, to belong, to live without fear. Instead, she was surveilled, discredited, and left to carry the psychological damage in private. The cost of speaking out was not opposition. It was erasure. Her death closed a chapter that Hollywood never reopened to examine its role. There were no apologies. No acknowledgement that power had been misused. No reckoning with how easily a young woman could be discarded once she stopped being useful. And yet Jean's story endures. It endures as a warning about what happens when fame replaces responsibility, when admiration substitutes for care, when silence is chosen over protection. She reminds us that talent is not armor and beauty is not safety. Jean Seberg was not weak, she was exposed. And in remembering her honestly, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most tragic stories are not about what someone did wrong, but about how completely they were left alone when it mattered most.